Good afternoon and welcome to the National Regulator Community of Practice webinar on Is Regulatory Failure a Good Teacher? We have participants from different parts of the world at this webinar, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging all First Peoples here today and pay my respects to them and to their forebears. We honour your wisdom and your stewardship of traditional lands and seas and your customs which enrich us all. I'm Simon Corden and I'm the Chair of the National Regulators Community of Practice and a Victorian Essential Services Commission Commissioner. On behalf of ANZOG and the National Regulator Community of Practice, I'm delighted to welcome you to our 9th webinar for 2021 and our 26th webinar since COVID struck. It's now my privilege to briefly introduce our two panellists for today, although I can see from the number of registrations we've had, they're already very well known to our regulatory community. So Bronwyn has been a lawyer for over 20 years. She recently established Weir Legal and Consulting Proprietary Limited after working for several years as a senior partner in a large law firm. Bronwyn advises regulators on regulatory practice, enforcement and compliance matters. In August 2017, she was co-appointed with Professor Peter Shergold by the Building Ministers Forum to make recommendations on a national best practice regulatory approach to regulation of the building sector. This work was commissioned shortly after the horrific London Grenfell Tower fire. Her appointment reflects Bronwyn's in-depth knowledge of building regulation, but also her work advising regulators on enhancing regulatory practice by operationalising risk-based decision-making. And Bronwyn has also been a TV star. In 2018, she appeared on the Four Corners program on the building industry. So welcome, Bronwyn. So our second speaker is David Chandler. So David was appointed to the role of the New South Wales Building Commissioner in 2019 after an impressive 40-year career in the Australian construction industry. David is improving the quality of construction and restoring trust in the industry through the delivery of Construct New South Wales in collaboration with the sector. David's delivered major infrastructure and urban renewal projects, including the new Parliament House in Canberra and Sydney's key apartments. As an adjunct professor in the School of Computing, Engineering and Mathematics at Western Sydney University, David helped shape the next generation of construction professionals and founded the Centre for Smart Modern Construction, which invests in new academic and research capabilities for the construction sector. David also appeared on the current affairs program 60 Minutes in 2020. So we've got an array of TV stars here today. So welcome, David.
Thank you.
So today's session will run along the following lines. We've got a special guest first up, and unfortunately only available to us on YouTube, who will bring us his unrivaled knowledge of the high-rise apartments sector to our discussion. After that, I'm going to have the privilege of interviewing our two wise and experienced speakers. We'll be talking not only about the details of regulating the building sector, obviously a crucially important issue, but also what we can all learn from them about being smart, effective and successful regulators. So the application of the lessons they've learnt and to other sectors outside building and construction. After which I'll open the conversation to you, our audience. We're aiming to leave as much time as possible for questions.
Well, good day, folks. Please come on in, take a look around, don't be shy. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to purchase your very own hastily vacated apartment in this poorly executed, shameless cash grab of a building. Shoddy materials, permissive planning laws, suspect certification, all of these factors combine to create a dazzling buyer's market with you in the driver's seat. A building so unique that it was a fixer-upper from the moment it was designed. That's right, folks, it's your very own Leaning Tower of Pisa. Why come to the apartment when the apartment can come to you? Whoa, look at that. Fun for the whole family. Friends, here at Barely Livable Real Estate, we pride ourselves on taking the most stringent construction regulations, then flushing those regulations down the toilet. At which point we normally have to call the plumber because the toilet wasn't installed properly to begin with. But as we say in the industry, why let safety stand in the way of your dreams? See, this place is falling apart, but it could be falling into your hands, folks. So please come on in, take a look around. Just a note, you will have to duck as you enter, as the ceiling heights have been reduced to their minimum legal requirements. But you know what that means? You get more neighbours. And trust me, you'll need all the friends you can get when you launch your class action 6 years from now. So look, as you take a look around, just a few features that are worth pointing out. First of all, you'll notice the absence of an effective national building code. lap that up. We sure did. Then, of course, the water views, specifically the water that's currently leaking through the roof and onto the floor. Please watch your step if you're heading into the kitchen. Now, question. Hands up if you've ever slept through your alarm clock and missed that important meeting in the office. We've all been there. Well, no such dramas if you buy this place, because you'll be woken up on the hour, every hour, by the unidentifiable, gut-wrenching, cracking noises that rattle through the entire structure. But you don't need to worry about any noise from local, state or federal governments. They've been completely silent on this issue for a couple of decades, and good on them. Now, did someone ask about a gym? We don't have one, but not to worry, because the elevator's been out of action since February, so you'll get plenty of exercise taking the stairs up 24 levels and back down each and every day. Great for the calves. And if that's not enough to get your heart rate up, trying to find emergency accommodation to house you and your young family when you receive a last-minute eviction notice certainly will. Well, look at that. Instant basement. You're welcome. But I know what you're thinking. Richard, how will I stay warm in the winter months? Well, don't worry, folks. The entire building is wrapped in highly flammable cladding, like a big, warm, snug cardigan. So accidentally knock over a candle and you'll be able to enjoy your very own open fire. And don't worry, the private building certifiers assured us it's totally safe, right after we paid them the required fee to assure us that it's totally safe. And speaking of fees, you'll be sure to save a packet on insurance premiums, because these dog boxes are literally uninsurable, and that means you'll be holding onto this asset forever, whether you like it or not. Good times. And who do you have to thank for this amazing purchasing opportunity, folks? Well, don't thank me. Thank years of poor planning oversight, cowboy developers, weak as piss councils, blame-shifting parliaments, and the ever-expanding human appetite for profit at the expense of properly regulated industries. So, folks, here we are. All apartments must go. Now's your chance to get in on the ground floor while there still is one. That'll be my 3 o'clock. Ciao.
So, recognising that Sammy J is a hard act to follow, first turn first to you, Bronwyn. I believe you've got a couple of slides to talk us through.
So, by way of background, as Simon mentioned, I was commissioned with Professor Peter Shergold in 2017 to conduct a review of the building industry regulatory system, and that was in the wake of the Grenfell fire. And deliberately one of many responses that governments made to the Grenfell fire and the concerns about combustible cladding. But what was recognised even at that time was that cladding was one symptom of a bigger problem in the industry, and in commissioning our report, the ministers identified several problems that they wanted us to look at, and we were to present them with a roadmap for best practice regulation and implementation of the code. The report was done quite quickly, over 6 months in total, and we presented it in February 2018. It was published a couple of months later. It was then a little while before we saw some real action in terms of implementing our report, although it was well received even early on and industry was quite supportive of the report. But we did sort of reach a period in late 2018 and early into 2019 where there were some significant events that caught the attention of the media, and there was a lot of activity and discussion, which of course also captures the attention of our ministers and the public in terms of potential issues in the industry. And so the culmination of quite a bit of media in early 2019 led to the establishment of an implementation team for the Building Confidence Report, which sits within the Australian Building Codes Board. Now, that's the body that, through an intergovernmental agreement, administers and develops the National Construction Code, which is adopted in all states and territories as the national technical code for building compliance. And so the ABCB were charged with developing tools and national guidance to assist the states to implement our 24 recommendations, and that work continues today. Now, for today's purposes, I'm also going to sort of interface with the arrival of David Chandler, who's my co-interviewee today. So David was appointed in August, so just after the BCR implementation team was established by the ministers. And we sort of laugh. I say that Peter Shergold and I put our toe in the water on these issues. Well, David came along with a massive splash. What he has achieved in the last 18 months is really quite phenomenal in terms of the New South Wales response to our report and to the issues in the industry as seen through the eyes of David Chandler. So within a matter of a few months, he had legislation drafted and passed in the New South Wales Parliament. And in particular, there's two pieces of legislation which respond to a number of our recommendations from our report, but and fundamentally change the way that the building approvals process works in New South Wales, and also the powers that the government has to step in and intervene in buildings under construction and make sure that they do not proceed through to off-the-plan sales. So the BCR work is due to be finished at the end of this year. And so that's progressing, and there's been enormous amounts of work done. So far, that team's issued 13 discussion papers. There are still, I think, 2 or 3 more to go, which they each one deals with different recommendations and proposals for national sort of frameworks or model powers and various different documents that are being issued in response to different recommendations that we made or groups of recommendations that we made. It includes model code of conduct for building surveyors, the private building surveyors, but it does apply, of course, to council building surveyors as well. And we're also they're also drafting one for fire safety engineers as well. So lots of different documents coming out as a package of materials that give guidance on how to implement our 24 recommendations to the states and territories. One last point I wanted to make about the report was that 7 of our 24 recommendations in some way were focused on regulatory practice issues. So as well as identifying considerable problems within the industry and with industry practitioners, we identified problems with the efficacy of regulators of the sector. And so one of our recommendations was to publish audit strategies for the oversight of commercial sector and to have annual reporting on those strategies. Now, that recommendation was made under the backdrop of there being pretty much no auditing of commercial buildings going on across the country. So by making that recommendation, we were asking regulators to actually commit to and develop strategies, publish them and start to report against them, so that we did have some oversight happening with our multi-storey buildings and in particular apartment buildings. So as is noted there on the slide, there were a number of recommendations that really went to the heart of regulatory practice improvement and are most relevant for today's discussion. Okay.
So thank you, Bronwyn. That's a fantastic overview of where we've got to since the initiation of the work that you did with Peter Shergold. So now we'll hand over to David. Anyone who follows David on LinkedIn will know he has an amazing reach with 15,000 views of his short videos highlighting non-compliance in his unconventional strategy to change the culture of the building development apartment sector in New South Wales. I'm now going to ask David to zoom in for us on how New South Wales has leveraged the massive industry and regulatory reform from this series of, I think it's fair to say, disasters in the high-rise sector, starting in London, as Bronwyn highlighted, but also extending to Victoria, New South Wales and even Dubai. So, David, if I can hand over to you to give us an overview of the New South Wales approach.
Well, thank you, Simon, and thank you all of the listeners who are joining us today, because I think we do have some interesting experience to share. This slide is just a quick snapshot of where Bronwyn and I started our conversations, probably in early 2019, when my role was sort of crystallising as the New South Wales Building Commissioner, and at the time we probably had a few areas where we didn't have alignment, and that I wanted to be quite clear that my view was that legislation alone was not going to turn this ship around, and that this industry has got many moving parts, and unless you actually take all of those parts along together, then in fact one without the other is just pointless. I put the top right hand slide up not for you to see in great detail, but it's a Gartner hype cycle, which was a slide that I had to present at my interview for this job as the Building Commissioner, to talk about where we might take it. And of course, with the Gartner hype cycle, you run through a period of time where everybody's excited about what's coming, and in this case the last 20 years of legislation were going to take us up that curve, but we found by the middle of 2018-19 that in fact we were back at a great point of disillusionment because none of those things had worked. So on the right hand side you'll see that there's a sort of step up as to where we want to go, from business as usual to changing the accreditation playing field, to getting the insurers back in the market, and ultimately creating the foundations for a strong regulator that's going to make the consumers confident to stay in the market. On the bottom left hand side is simply my observation of the regulator, probably all regulators, but specifically let's say New South Wales, where the majority of the regulator's effort was really being exerted 3 to 6 years after projects had been built. So in a way, it was trying to clean up a mess that was already there. And of course, it's very hard to change the course of history when the damage has already been done. So what we've achieved in the last 18 months in New South Wales is that the majority of the regulators' efforts now are focused on what we call driving the bus from the front. And I can assure you that going forward, that the New South Wales regulators' effort will be very much at the front end. So all of that translated into what's known as Construct New South Wales. 6 pillars is the strategy. Pillar 1 is about the legislation. Pillar 2 is about risk and rating. Pillar 3 is about industry capability building. Pillar 4 is about transactions and contracts to address the issues that are in that space. Pillar 5 looks at the technology that's required to underpin a modern construction industry, particularly modernising the regulator. And Pillar 6 moves away from policy being driven by opinion and making sure that there's a deep-seated understanding of actually data and facts as opposed to opinion. Because when I first came in, I would say that the majority of the discussions were opinion-based and very little fact. So the next slide simply deals with the pivot that's occurred in New South Wales. And historically, regulators have focused on all of the bit players and very little on the top of the apex, which is essentially the transaction between the developer and a customer, where the developer accepts a deposit and then promises to deliver a building that meets the promise that the consumer signed up for, and eventually causes them to settle and then own the product. Well, there was very little accountability of that particular transaction. And so for most of the time that I've been on board, and most of the time remaining, we're now going to focus on how do we transform the understanding of that transaction and make the parties in that transaction at that high level more accountable. So the messaging translated very quickly into saying to developers, you can make good choices and bad choices. There are consequences for bad choices. You appoint the designers, you appoint the contractor, and you appoint the certifiers. You pay them, you own them. So it's been a fairly brutal exposure to simply say, stop blaming the waterproofer, stop blaming the bricklayer or the designer. If you've hired a bad one because you wanted to cut corners, your problem, not my problem. And I want to be in your face in the interests of a customer to make sure that if you've made bad choices, you've got to wear those bad choices before you can complete your transaction. So look, where we're up to, I think it's just a useful slide next to show you, is that we're really starting to unpack this concept of harms. I have to say that I haven't been in government before. I haven't been a regulator before. I've just been simply a hard-nosed constructor, but I do understand how transactions work. And so if you're looking at the way we're leading into the future, we want to start to look at the areas where the regulator should focus most of its efforts and those areas where it should focus least, and what parts of the industry could start to step up and share some of that governance overload that we've had in the past, and make sure that we're getting a better deal for taxpayers and consumers by applying our efforts at the right end of the spectrum. So on the left-hand side, we've now built a very powerful capability in the regulator through our intelligence unit, and we're focused on the character, the motivations and the opportunities of those players that we think are risky. And I can assure you that we're pretty much now at 100% likelihood of landing on a risky player each time we set out for an audit, and we keep checking that against whether we're overburdening our profiling with a risk bias, and I think we've got that pretty right at the moment. So those that are presenting to us as risky will see more regulatory interventions. We expect that in the longer term they'll pay for higher PI and lending costs. They'll certainly have no brand value, and they'll certainly see a high customer churn. Whereas on the right-hand side, and I think really Bronwyn gave me the insights into the distinction between burdens and privileges. And so we are making privileges very much the aspiration of the trustworthy developers, and you can see the elements that make up that sort of assessment around character, the capability of the entity and its capital, because we think that we must have consumers doing business with people that have those trustworthy characteristics and are least likely to cause them harm. So that's a pretty high level overview of just what's driving us, Simon. And I think now let's get back to your question and the conversation you'd like to have between the two of us.
Fantastic. Look, thank you both for those presentations. David, I'm hopeful that we're past the trough of disillusionment and into the slope of enlightenment as flagged in your slides. Let's hope we're in that part of the cycle. For those of you who'd be interested, the slides and as I mentioned earlier, this presentation will be available on YouTube after the session. So we've had a few.
I just wanted to make the comment, Simon, that I hope the next time you run this, instead of hashtag, what is it? Hashtag. The next time it's hashtag confidence.
Absolutely, I think that's what we're all striving to do, isn't it? Build trust in the industries that we regulate, so that consumers can feel confident that they're getting what they're promised. The first question I'll throw to David, I think, is from we got from Slido. It's the most popular one today. It's how do you see the implications of government around light touch regulations, as seen in this topic and others? The person's flagging the Banking Royal Commission leading to failures. I think for our purpose, interesting to see with it light touch regulation in terms of the rules, or light touch in terms of how they're administered and enforced. Perhaps, David, you'd want to comment on that?
Well, Simon, I think it's about getting the balance right about what government regulators can do well and what industry should do better. So, both parties have a lot to do here. So if we talk about light touch, what I'm a subscriber to is, if you've got the effective measures in place to see where everybody's playing and what they're doing, then you really should focus your efforts on those and not spend a lot of effort on places where there's no need to be heavy-handed. So people perhaps get this light touch misconstrued at times. It's a case of probably better being described as the right touch.
It's about where you focus your efforts. So those who are good performers experience a light touch, and those who are underperforming developers or regular duty holders experience heavy touch. Bronwyn, did you want to add anything to that based on your experience?
Yeah, I will. I think another way of looking at this issue is, what is light touch? The fact is, when you have industries that require complex specialist knowledge for them to operate, which we do in construction and there is in many other sectors, you have to rely to some extent on industry. You have to rely on professionalism amongst different practitioner groups within the sector to actually perform, hold each other to account, not because there's a regulator tapping them on the shoulder. And of course, there's a role for regulators, but the more you expect the regulator to technically oversee, the more the regulator actually has to take capability out of the industry to do that, which in the construction sector, there is a chronic shortage of skills. So trying to find this balance between light touch, regulatory intervention, what we expect of the industry in terms of self-regulation, which some might see as light touch, is very complicated and tricky. But there is no doubt in my mind that we need to actually have equal measure of industry participation and regulation of itself, together with government oversight. And I know regulators, sometimes the analogy is they're the conductor of the orchestra. You know, they can influence, they can have a role that's effective, but they have to let the players continue with their very specialist knowledge and expertise in order for complex buildings to be constructed.
Really interesting. I think, David, you were reflecting on you're trying to create incentives for the industry players, to the insurers, the finance firms and others, to sort of put some market discipline on the players, which I think is sort of in line what you're suggesting, Bronwyn. We've sort of got a related question, which I'll again direct to David in the first instance, about how do you make choices where to direct regulatory intervention given the inevitability of scarce resources? You know, you've got you're not a huge regulator, and so as someone, you mentioned you're new to being a regulator, what approach did you take to working out where to focus your scarce resources?
Well, I think it's important to contextualise where a modern regulator sits, and what I look back over my career and projects and organisations I've taken over to transform is that they've almost become relics of the past. And so I think we've first and foremost got to face the fact that we're 20 years into this century and we're still using the technologies to drive it of the last century. And so the first thing we had to do is to look at, well, what is the available kit available to a regulator these days to actually assemble the data that they need to do their job. So at this stage, I'm able to draw on probably one of the largest data holdings outside the military in Australia to actually make these choices. So for people who think you can live your life under a bushel in the future, we will land on you. So we're now landing on developers who've been able to be quite opaque in the past, and that opacity has gone. I think the other element that you need to sit back and say, well, what's the landscape that we're trying to regulate? Well, we've really run regulations through single jurisdiction lenses for too long. So everybody looks through their lens, New South Wales, Victoria, whatever, and then we try and get some sort of aggregation at the top. But of course, the Federation works against that. So what I wanted to do was to make sure that in New South Wales, to the extent possible, we use multi-jurisdictional focus in the solutions that we're coming up with, because the global construction supply chain these days, that ecosystem goes everywhere. There would, probably more than 60% of the inputs on a construction site today come from somewhere that's different to the construction site. We don't make buildings on site anymore. So a modern regulator has got to be able to use data and understand the potential of data. We've got to be able to look beyond a single jurisdictional focus and realise we are in a global industry, and we've got to start to know confidently that if there's a piece of glass coming from Belgium, that we can authenticate that piece of glass before it comes to Australia and into the building. So we've got to set up the capabilities to do that, and we're making great progress on all of that.
Fantastic. Bronwyn, I might ask you to comment on that as well, because my recollection is several years ago, when NR, the National Regulator Community of Practice, was an early stage, you ran a series of courses or workshops in Melbourne on risk-based regulation. So I've been interested, we've got you here as a building regulation guru, but your experience is much broader than that. I wonder if you could comment on what you've seen in terms of the challenge of prioritising resources.
Yeah, well, every regulator has that challenge. I don't think I've come across a regulator yet that's got enough resources to look at everybody they're regulating in a comprehensive way. And so risk-based regulation has been, on the agenda now for a long time, in terms of everybody saying that they're doing it or wanting to do it or wanting to improve how they do it. And so it's an ongoing, I think, skill and challenge for regulators to be risk-based in the way that they operate. It's quite easy to say that they're risk-based at a policy level or with their enforcement and compliance policy. It's another thing to do it in practice. And so, at the heart of that is around having ways to find the riskiest regulated entities to focus attention on, which is what David's talking about in terms of how do you get that information and reliable data to enable you to focus on those that are more likely to cause harm. And so I would say that almost every regulator I've worked with has data issues around that, and data rich, but not having the capacity to mine that data effectively to find the risky players. The other thing is that regulators are generally stuck in a tap that they can't turn off in terms of complaints and volume that comes to them for assessment, response and review, whereas the proactive approach of having data sources to be able to go out and, as David mentions, get in front of the curve, go out while things are happening so they can be remedied much more effectively and quickly, rather than always coming in at the end after something's in place and it's more expensive and more difficult to undo it. So that struggle to be more proactive is something that all regulators have, and I have, though, seen a change, I would say, over the last 10 years, that there being more of an investment and deliberateness about proactive regulation, which is great, but I think it's an ongoing challenge for all regulators to shift their model towards proactive and risk-based regulation towards those riskiest in the system.
Thanks,
But I would make the comment just on that, is that I'm really pleased that the government has delivered on all of its promises when I took this role on. So we've had a massive investment in digital since I've been on board to build the capability. So we're now standing up legislation in New South Wales, the Design and Building Practitioners Act, where we've actually built the digital capability to actually support the legislation. And on the 1st of July, when it turned on, the legislation turned on, but so did the digital capability to support implementing it. The other element of what I think New South Wales has done in walking the talk as opposed to just talking it is that we've got new boots on the ground. We have got new resources. So we've had 30 new people injected into the Office of Fair Trading in the last year. We've got real industry practitioners out there, not your traditional regulators, but real practitioners, boots on the ground, getting into jobs and being able to look at them seriously at the front end. We've got another 30 going to come on, basically funded to support the standing up of declared designs and declared as-builts. So the government has backed up this exercise, with a huge spend on digital capability and a very large spend on new boots on the ground.
Quite extraordinary how quickly that's all happened, because, when you think digital, it's not a sort of 5-year exercise. You've been able to do that in pretty quick time. Bronwyn, I've got a question to throw to you. This session is about regulatory failure and being opportunistic about using that to drive regulatory change. Someone's commented on the condo failure in Florida, which is not so much, as I understand it, about the construction stage, but subsequent the ongoing experience with the building. Do you have any sort of reflections on how that incident in Florida can be used to drive change in Australia?
Yeah, I think so. We're talking there about a 40-year-old building that has early indications failed through lack of maintenance, and also other sort of, I guess, geographical features around where the building was situated and weather conditions and so forth. But what it really goes to is this issue of post-construction quality and maintenance of buildings. And we have a huge issue with that in this country, as would many that have had 30 years of the development of multi-storey apartment living and office buildings. So starting to look at some of the material coming out of the US on the examination of this issue, there was a really great article that talked about the push for condominium growth in Florida, but in other parts of America. And we've certainly had also lots of high-rise development in the last 30 years. And even well-constructed buildings need to be maintained over time and have a certain life to them. And so this issue then becomes one of, what is required around maintenance? How do you manage that with multiple, in some cases, hundreds of individual lot owners who have to participate in funding and ensuring that inspections and maintenance works go on. So there is, this is a huge wake-up call for us in Australia in terms of post-construction issues, which have largely been left unregulated. And certainly there are requirements for this in owners corporation legislation and so forth, but in practice, we're not seeing the effort on, or the scrutiny on this area that needs to be. And it's the same issue came up with Grenfell. That was a refurbishment of an older building, and there was a bunch of issues around, what do you do when you do those sorts of refurbishments and how that might affect the integrity of the underlying building, and then who's responsible for those being done in a way that doesn't actually reduce the safety levels, which is what happened in Grenfell. So, yeah, these post-construction issues are another very unfortunate situation that we have to take strong notice of.
David, do you have any observations on how we use a failure in one jurisdiction, in this case Florida? I mean, Grenfell was the source of the work that Bronwyn and Professor Shergold did. Do you have any observations on how you use that as the catalyst to get action in a jurisdiction 8,000 miles away?
One of the things I've learned very quickly in this role is to avoid being an armchair commentator on someone else's problems. So I've been not attracted to any comment on that event, and I won't be.
Right.
Let me assure you, however, though, that the knowledge of backlog maintenance is something that the day I took the job and had a cup of tea with the Premier, she said, David, I want you to focus on making sure that this backlog maintenance issue is not the thing that comes and gets us if we turn the rest of the industry around. And Bronwyn will attest to the fact that I've had her do some preliminary work on just how the dysfunctional side of strata communities could be improved, because it is an area that both of us feel as though we need to tackle. In terms of a crisis, the crisis that's motivating New South Wales is we want our customers back. We've gone from 23,000 apartment completions a year in New South Wales. We're going to do 14 or 15,000 apartments this year. So the crisis that we've got is we want the customers back.
Yeah, important issue in building trust with such an important, with the cost of housing, the cost of existing housing going up so much because we need the supply. It's a really critical issue. One of the questions we had, and I think, Bronwyn, perhaps you could answer this first. The person commented, you were both told your report was urgent, but the responses have been drawn out over a long period. Any thoughts on accelerating government responses in high-risk areas?
Look, it's tricky. So Peter Shergold and I made a specific recommendation around the implementation of our report. We said that the recommendation should be implemented as a package in 3 years. And we knew that was very ambitious, but we felt that if we didn't put a recommendation around the time frame, that it would not, there would be no sort of impetus, if you like. So it was important for us to include that in the recommendations. It's more than 3 years now since our report was issued, and but at least we did put it in there. So I think it's something that, as being involved in a report like this or any sort of review and recommendations to government, you're very mindful of, and the best you can do really is to include that in the report and try to set a benchmark for governments to be held accountable to, but the reality is that these political cycles, policy development cycles and legislative cycles are generally very long, way too long. David's managed to short circuit that in his involvement, and the authorising environment he has is really quite extraordinary, and you know, we might want to talk about that a little bit more. But what David has had over the last 18 months is not usual, but it's certainly a great example of what can be achieved, and that the timeframes don't need to be so long. It's just a matter of governments with competing priorities and different parts of election cycles and so forth, where you get things that slip under the cracks or away from the attention of those timeframes.
David, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think one of the causes, Simon, is that there's a lot of self-interest that pushes back on all of this. So it's you know, we've got obviously the states' rights issues to do in Australia, where people sort of feel that you need to be very careful that you don't become intrusive from a federal level into the state, and I think that's probably right. But you know, materials manufacturers are a very heavy lobby group. We've seen this with cladding materials. They're unashamed heavy lobbyists about how much stuff they can sell, and they're never much around at the end when it's been installed to be accountable for it. So there's a lot of self-interest out there, and what I've tried to do in New South Wales is to build a consensus that started off with getting rid of everybody. I think there were 35 people sitting around my first working group, and all they did was point to somebody across the table and say it's the problem over there, instead of realising that the problem's here. I can tell you 18 months into this, nobody sits at any table that I'm involved in these days and points to somebody else as being the cause of the problem. So vested interest, people thinking that it's everybody else's problem before we start, I think they're the things that we had to get. And again, if you've been given the authority that I've been given and the support, I mean, I don't think we've been perfect. We've done some things that I look back on and think I'd do them differently, but that's okay. And I've really got to the fact that we've now in this second phase of transformation here, and I've got to the point where I don't need to ask for permission going forward. I'm just going to ask for forgiveness.
Yeah, look, what I think I've been fascinated, David, is your use of LinkedIn. You're very active in communicating to presumably to the sector through that, and you know, very high levels of interest in your short videos, etc., that you're doing. Did you want to talk about how you use that communication strategy to build change and also strengthen or maintain your authorising environment?
Well, governments have cloned public servants to be actually quite shy in terms of their ability to come out. I guess in some ways that if you had a public servant that had a bigger media profile than a minister, that would probably be somewhat career limiting. Well, I'm not terribly bothered by that because fishing is my next career choice. So I'm not terribly bothered by that. But look, that aside, is that I don't think a modern regulator and leader, because this is about leadership as well, can do so by hiding under a bushel. So, for example, you commented on a post I put up a few weeks ago about that concrete that was chopped out in the stairways. Well, that went through 185,000 views last night. The reach that is there, and I'm about to move into the next phase where I'm going to start putting names on this stuff, because you know, when you're starting to get that viewer level and people may not be getting it, that you do want them to change the game, well, we're going to move into a little bit of shaming. And so there'll be a few engineers that you can expect to see starting in the next week that I'm going to be saying to Engineers Australia, well, you've seen these structural issues that are going on in some of these buildings, and you have not rung me once to say who was that engineer. It's time we got that engineer before our credentials committee and started to tidy his game up. Well, I'll play the game back now and saying, that engineer, when do you think you might do something about that engineer? Because I'm going to stop him right now.
Amazing. I mean, it is an interesting, you know, strengthening the incentives for those self-regulatory models like Engineers Australia to work more vigorously. There's a lot of change to be had there.
Not really.
The other comment I might make there, Simon, is that what's been fascinating about David and his communication strategy is that there is a balance between continuing to call out problems, which often governments are very loath to do, and offering the solution or showing the response to those problems in order to not just continue to run the industry down, but to try to build the confidence that there is a response to all of this. So, you know, when I was on Four Corners and I was asked the question, would I buy an apartment? And I said no. It was this sort of, you know, I copped a fair few people who didn't like me saying that and, you know, worried about the impact on confidence and those sorts of things. But, you know, David's taken that to the next level, but of course he's in the driver's seat and he can provide the response and the improvement that goes with the criticism. So his approach is really quite unique, and I think that other regulators that are listening today are looking at their use of social media, and I do think doing it effectively is really important vehicle for change and influence. And you know, David is a bit of a trailblazer in terms of the potential that can come with having a big profile. And I think, David, you would post, if not every day, every second day, some sort of comment and or short article.
I've got now a few assistants, Bronwyn, that help me get them out a couple of times a week, and if I've got a bit of energy left on a Sunday afternoon, I might do my own, but there'll be one going up today that I expect will probably kick over the 100,000 mark in the next week. So I've got a couple of good people that have taught me some tricks about it in the last 6 months, and I call my assistant the social media whisperer, because she's really been quite amazing in the work that she's done to support me. But look, I don't do these things just to be annoying or to be unconstructive. I always see an end game for every piece. And Simon, the elephant in the room has been the neglect that we've put into educating the next cohort of constructors. Now, I know that I wander into an area that may at times aggravate some of the players, at times it's upset Bronwyn, but one of the elephants in the room is simply that the education system has raped and pillaged the construction industry. It is a good cash cow in every university, and for every dollar that's been taken in undergraduate fee income, only about 30 cents in the dollars put back into the content of the course. That is showing up as I walk around and see graduates of universities running projects, engineers, construction managers, quantity surveyors, certifiers, is that these people are showing the exhibits of an undercooked system that didn't teach them or credential them property before they left the sector. So some of those videos that you're seeing would have been done purposely so that they can land back in the classroom today. So I can tell you now that there are lecturers in the universities who are playing those small little segments to their students, saying, well, you wouldn't want a building commissioner pulling you up and putting your project up on that. So I'm very pleased that much of this stuff is going straight into the classroom. And if that's where we're going to have an impact on the next cohort of constructors, then I'm really pleased to see that sort of consumption.
I think a point to raise there, Simon, if I might, is that one of the things that I've observed David doing in terms of regulatory practice is a lot of regulators have issues with the qualifications or the RTOs that are delivering participants into their sector. And it's one of these sort of very sort of common complaints. I know regulators that have sort of lists of RTOs where if the applicant for approval or registration fronts up with one of these qualifications, they're seen as dubious. And there's a bit of a I guess a fatalistic view that, you know, the education systems that support these different regulatory sectors are not adequate. Whereas, you know, David's actually not too interested in complaining about it, but he's interested in doing something about it. And so he's invested heavily in educational material, engaging with the educators around the quality of courses and trying to lift that standard proactively himself. And I think in general across Australia now, in terms of the competency of registered building practitioners, there's much more focus on what's in the courses, what are we teaching them. I mean, we learned that architects who are responsible for the design of building in, the most that time that they spend in a 5-year course on learning about the National Construction Code in the 6 courses that are running in New South Wales is 6 hours over 5 years. They're clearly not being taught the fundamentals around the construction code that they need once they get into the industry. And so that's just one example of an underdone educational system to support the regulatory framework and the competencies that we need. But other areas where David's done this is looking at the financiers of the sector and the insurers of the sector, and really trying to look at the whole ecosystem outside of just his building regulatory responsibility under the legislation, and see how these other players interact. And I think that's something that should be of interest to other regulators in terms of these other factors that influence regulatory outcomes and the harms that we're trying to regulate as regulators.
I think that's really interesting. David talked before about working back the supply chain for the inputs, so glass from Belgium or whatever. You're obviously also thinking about working back through the supply chain of the skills that are on building sites. And I think, Bronwyn, you're right, that's an issue for any regulator that is responsible for professional regulation of tradespeople or skilled professionals. That's one relationship. We've got a question about, David, about your relationship with other regulators. So the example the person gave in the question is the health and safety regulator. So if you could talk briefly about your connections with them, because often other regulators can be a source of data or identify problems that might be relevance in their sector, but also relevance to your sector, your responsibilities. Could you talk about that briefly?
Yeah, I think it's been an interesting journey in that space as well, because it didn't take us long to work out that when we ran the risk modelling and said, well, what were the 2 key factors, for example, that would identify a project that was likely to be non-compliant, it was a project that had the highest incidence of safety corrections notices during the course of construction. So we immediately have an indicator from SafeWork that says one of the telltales of a likely non-compliant building is a builder who doesn't care about safety and his workforce. So then you can line that up with and say, well, where are the certifiers that are causing us the most grief? And in the early days, we were able to quickly build out a risk profile that says, what are the top 20 certifiers that are causing us grief, and what are the top builders who've got the lousiest safety record? And guess what? The top 20 lined up exactly. So there's a whole bunch of measures that you can use. So we've now joined up our databases with Department of Planning. So we're able now to make sure that we get a single source of truth on projects from the Department of Planning's digital platform. We're working with Fire and Rescue because they go around to the buildings and do the call outs after buildings have been done and discover whether installations have been put in properly or not. So we've entered into a whole range of data sharing agreements with these key agencies. We entered into a new one in the last couple of weeks with the Land Registry Services, because it became apparent to us that some of these opaque developers can't identify a source of funds. So we're actually able then now to look at all the land that's being used for these developments and see, is there a legitimate bank that's actually supporting the project, or where are the funds coming from? So expect to see a little bit of noise coming from that space as well, because unregulated funding sources are potentially another hazard or harm that is contributing to our industry.
Fascinating. Yeah, look, that joining up with other entities and regulators is, it's such a crucial source of intelligence. We've got a question for you, Bronwyn. You work with many regulators, some quite small. What's your advice about dealing with a hot mess, they've described it, if you can't invest heavily in intelligence?
I mean, I guess small regulators have advantages in some respects in terms of being able to have a more consistent approach, because, the larger you get with more people making decisions, the harder it is to control the consistency of those decisions, so small regulators can be more agile and be able to respond in a consistent manner. I think even a small regulator, though, also can use the intelligence it has. I mean, if they're a small regulator, perhaps they've got a small regulatory, the small number of regulatory entities they're responsible for as well. So there's a relativity there. Look, hot messes come up with every regulator, and I think the point is that having courage to deal with it. You know, David's talked about naming and shaming. He's got this very public profile, things that make regulators very nervous. And I think that even small regulators can be very effective if they do make the hard decisions and they are willing to follow through and use those regulatory tools at the top of their pyramid. I can't tell you the number of regulators I've dealt with that have never done a prosecution. Now, if you're going to take away, you know, you're supposed to have a regulatory toolkit that you draw on for different, in different circumstances. If you're never going to use your most effective and serious powers, you're really, you know, confining your ability to have an impact when something has happened that really warrants the use of those powers. So I think for any size regulator, it's about those sorts of issues and making sure that you are using your full kit and that you've got the courage to move forward when you see something that is incredibly high risk or, you know, a very serious near miss that really needs to have a strong statement in the regulatory response.
David, did you want to add anything to that? I mean, there might be some sense that you're a huge regulator, but I don't think your unit isn't actually, it's in a large department, but it's not a huge regulator by any means. So did you want to talk a little bit about how you've dealt with that? And that's probably the last question before we finish up, I think.
Well, the Office of Building Commission New South Wales is, I think we've just topped out at 15 people. So we've actually driven all of this with 15 people. Our exercise has been to transform the traditional regulator into a modern regulator, and we'll get that job done sometime towards the back end of next year. And then we won't need the 15 people that are sitting in my office, but we've done that with 15 people. One of the things that's, I think it's a good closing piece to throw back to Bronwyn in a second, is that Bronwyn's been a great matchmaker as well. So her vision is that, in fact, we start to join up some of the country's regulators, and we've both reached out to Victoria, and I've got to say there's some pretty positive response there, that if we could start to explore some harmonisation opportunities in the next year, that would be fantastic. Our doors open to other smaller jurisdictions, Tasmania, South Australia, Northern Territory, ACT, that if they ever wanted to sort of look at how do they become co-owners of some of the digital capability we've got, I understand the door's open in New South Wales to make those sorts of resources available to other jurisdictions, because they're very expensive to build, and it's just nonsensical that you'd build these again and again in other regulatory environments. So the door's open, and I understand that there's a couple of the smaller players wanting to come and see us as soon as there's been a clearance on COVID, to actually say, well, what could we do to start to see if we could use some of your capabilities under a license agreement in other jurisdictions. So Bronwyn's really been pushing that pretty hard. I don't know whether you want to close out, but that's probably where we're up to.
I don't know if I've got time, but absolutely. I mean, the BCR was about a national response to issues in the industry, and I think there are lots of sectors where the federated structure provides a level of fragmentation that's unhelpful in terms of regulating what are national sectors. So absolutely, you know, it's good to be able to connect people, or, you know, identify the most appropriate person in a jurisdiction and pass names around. It's a pretty simple thing to do, and something that I'm privileged to be able to do.
So that's great, and a great way to end this webinar, given that the National Regulators Community of Practice is all about connecting regulators up with in each jurisdiction or across jurisdictions. And I think this has been a really interesting conversation today. I'd like to thank you again to both our speakers and to your audience for your enthusiastic participation with the questions you've raised and voted on Slido. As regular participants in these webinars know, you'll shortly receive a short evaluation survey in your inbox. If you could please take the time to fill that in. ANZOG and National Regulator Community of Practice really appreciate your feedback, and it's certainly been really important in us evolving how we do these webinars over the last 15 months. There's also a section at the end of the evaluation form where you can pitch your idea for an upcoming webinar, and we really value those that input as well, because that really helps us make sure that we continue to provide relevant webinars that really attract a good audience.